Southern Eye examines a secret report that convinced the wartime government that Southampton was on the brink of collapse. It's a report which sits uneasily with tales of heroism and camaraderie as the heart of Southampton was bombed out of existence. The Blitz destroyed the heart of the town. Shops, factories, and 14 churches were flattened. 214 men, women, and children died. But in government circles, there was real fear that Southampton was broken. 4 days after the bombings, a government inspector arrived. Wing Commander John Hodsoll came to see how the air raid precautions had worked. His report suggested civilian morale had collapsed through lack of leadership.
There is no outstanding personality in the local Southampton government at all. The mayor is a poor creature, and as far as could be made out, disappeared about 3 o'clock every afternoon in order to get home in safety. The other councillors are none of them of such a calibre as could be put in charge, and the whole place is also apparently riddled with intrigue.
These people, after all, were human beings who were doing jobs for which not only had they not been trained, but nobody could ever have been trained because nobody knew what the job was going to be before the war came. At the outset of war, the assumption was that the big strain was going to be on hospital accommodation because there were going to be millions and millions of casualties almost instantly. So you had a huge reservoir of emergency hospital accommodation for the expected casualties, which did not materialise because bombs in Britain did not cause as many casualties as expected. The other post-raid facilities were, as it were, stunted and held back in favour of this medical provision, so that the rest centres in Southampton, as in other places, were not particularly well organised, and inevitably a lot of them got knocked out by the bombs anyway, so that a couple of days after the raids, a mass observer doing a report on the town can only find 2 of the 24 rest centres, which is where people are supposed to report after they've been made homeless.
What I do remember as reporters, that we did discover that after the Blitz, really there was a lack in organisation in Southampton. I think it was certainly true that people were left after the November 40 raids. A great many of the homeless were left without clothing, bedding, until a very freezing Christmas. And it was only when officials were sent from London to cut the red tape that they were able to supply clothing to a lot of people who hadn't got any. They lost everything in the raids because there was nothing in the shops. The shops had lost their stocks. And really, not very much was done to provide any emergency supply of clothing. And the other thing that Southampton seemed to be lacking was any sort of communal feeding plan.
So far as could be ascertained, the civil defence services had generally behaved extremely well under most trying circumstances. The civil machine, on the other hand, appeared to have come almost to a complete standstill.
All sorts of things went wrong under the pressure of the bombing, which couldn't entirely have been foreseen. There was a terrible shortage of dispatch riders, for instance. There was only one van to go around supplying information after the local newspaper had been knocked out, which meant that the newspaper couldn't be used as a source of information to people. And so, I mean, one has to have sympathy now with the poor bloody local government officials and elected members of local government who were being asked to perform way beyond anything that had been expected of them before. The most damaging stories in the Hodsoll report, to my mind, are not about officials. They're about the first aid service, where it seems that after the third big raid, the first aid service was down to 25% of its strength. And about half its members had simply gone missing. A couple of doctors had gone missing, had simply deserted, as it were, in the face of the enemy. And there was a specific instance of 3 members of a first aid party who had refused to go out and were clearly hoping to get sacked, so Hodsoll concluded, so that they could get another job with better money. By that stage of the war, if you were in air raid precautions and similar, your wages compared very unfavourably with those that people were earning in war industry. And there was quite a lot of reasons why you might want to get out of the civil defence services.
The other thing was that Southampton shelters could have been better. The shelters in Southampton were really not adequate when one thinks of the years of bombing the town experienced. I mean, there was no doubt about it. People in Southampton used to say, oh, how we envy the Londoners with their tube stations. I mean, there was a feeling that the shelters were not adequate.
And then the planes were on top of us, a whole wave of them. The whole shelter was like vibrating with the noise of them. My mom was moving her lips. You could read her praying, saying the same words over and over again into herself. And then the bombs began to drop, at first away from us, and then closer. That's the church they've got! They've got the church! I know it, George, I know!
It's nowhere near the church. Take it easy,
nothing
love.
is safe, even the house of God! What are we going to do, Helen? What are we going to do? Mom, it'll be all right. It'll be all right, Mum.
Most nights we slept in shelters for the simple reason you never knew when there was going to be a blitz. So rather than go to bed and be there for about 5 minutes and have to get up, we had our beds made in the shelters.
You could hear the dirt dropping down on top of our shelter. And Dad and I, we said to one another, well, that seemed a bit close, seems could possibly be the house, you know. So I looked out at the shelter and the house was okay. And then after about 5-10 minutes we heard voices and went and had a look. And unfortunately there had been a direct hit on the shelter in the garden next to us, which was about, what, 30 feet away, that was all. And unfortunately the father, the mother and the 2 children were killed. And yet only a few feet away was the chicken run, and in there were all these chicken. There wasn't a feather off of them.
They've got the church, I know!
It's nowhere near the church. Take it easy, love.
Something's a near one. They've laid it flat. The whole church. Everything's destroyed. Father Kennelly's and all the other fathers.
Shall I go and see?
Stay here, for God's sake.
It's quietening down a bit.
There was one episode, I was stood at the back door here, and it was the time when the people came out of the aircraft factory, and a fighter plane came down from the road, and I could see the pilot in it, and it was firing at the people coming home from work.
Mostly it was a feeling of helplessness. There was, when the gun stopped firing and there wasn't a lot of ammunition left, the feeling was that, you know, there was nothing to hit back with, nobody was doing anything, you were being bombed, and really nobody was helping very much. And I think it was frustration, helplessness, combined with fear, because people were trekking then at the town in large numbers. A mere fraction of the people in Southampton were left at night.
After we'd had nights and nights of bombing in Southampton and not getting a lot of sleep, obviously they were bombing the town and not the country. So what we all decided to do, several roads, I mean we were mountains of us, we packed up our blankets and headed out for the country, which was out Rownham's way then, which is all built up now, of course. And we were quite sure then that we were going to have a few hours of even just sitting on the edge of the countryside and singing. And we would all march out, then we'd all march back again about 3 o'clock in the morning, when we were hoping all the bombing had finished.
It was reported that a number of people had left the town on previous nights and slept in the woods, but it was understood that this practice had now stopped and everything was being done to see that it did not recur.
What officials and others thought they were seeing was something like what had happened in France a bit earlier, when the German army had been advancing and French civilians fled in droves in front of the advancing German army, pushing their belongings in prams and carts and so on. So the word refugees was originally applied to the people who were later called trekkers. But as the dust, in a sense, literally settled, I think the opinion would form that trekking was no bad thing.
It meant that, thank goodness, they had common sense. They all started to evacuate about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to the surrounding villages outside Southampton in the New Forest, and they would return the next morning. And this, no doubt, is the reason why our casualties really were so low with the number of bombs that dropped.
The evidence was, from Britain and later from Germany, that people running away from bombs were often very good at running back. And in fact, if you look at the records in Southampton, you'll see that one thing which did go quite well after the raids, which the authorities did organise rather well, was emergency transport. The trams were running remarkably quickly, and transport was laid on to bring workers back from where they fled to. And so long as that was there, so long as the transport service could be sustained or improvised in some way, then you could still keep vital industries going. The work of Southampton docks, it seems, was not badly affected by this horrendous bombardment.
630 people died in 51 raids. The town was left in ruins, but people carried on. The Hodsoll report remained secret. When it was released 30 years later, the city councillors insisted it was wrong. To this day, their rebuttal lies alongside Hodsoll's account. Certainly, Southampton recovered to take centre stage in the D-Day landings. And as war in Europe came to a close, the role of those on the home front was properly acknowledged.